From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Jonathan Yardley. I'm the book critic of the Washington Post. Thank you. I've made a special walk down from Logan Circle to introduce my friend and colleague of 30 years, more than 30 years, Michael Dirda. I suspect, judging by what I can see in the audience, that there are many people here who remember the good old book world. And the way every Sunday, Michael was at one end of the section and I was at the other. Two very different critics, reviewers, bringing, I think, a particularly lively discussion of current books to what all of us felt was the best book section in the United States. Much regretted. Michael's written a lovely little book about one of his lifelong passions, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He begins it by reflecting on, quoting Graham Greene, and reflecting on the way the books of one's youth stay with one throughout one's life. One of the many things that I love about Michael as a writer and as a reader is that he's always been true to the reading of his youth. And he retains his old enthusiasm. He's a romantic at heart, and the deep romantic love for books, particularly books of a certain kind. We have sci-fi right next door, which is one of Michael's enthusiasms. What amazes me about Michael is that he has read every book that's ever been published. Well, or at least that's what I thought until I read his book on Arthur Conan Doyle and discovered that Michael, like me, has never read The Cloister and the Hearth, for which, by everything I have been told, he is to be commended. But I discovered something very interesting the other day. A few weeks ago, I've been on a Henry James jag, which I think at the age of 72 is about time. And I had just read for the first time The Portrait of a Lady and was absolutely awed by it, one of the great books that I've read. And a few days later, I was in the meeting of what remains of Book World, and we were discussing a book about the writing of The Portrait of a Lady by the literary scholar Michael Gora. And I didn't think I was up to it, but I said, well, by goodness, that seems to me right down Michael Dirda's alley. And one of my colleagues said, well, we offered it to Michael, and he said he couldn't review it because he's never read The Portrait of a Lady. And all I can say is, Michael, what a treat you have waiting for you. I have to go and pack for Paris. I'm sorry to leave you, but my friend and colleague, Michael Dirda.
Thank you, John. Can you all hear me all right? If not, signal wildly. John says I have read everything. Of course, John has read everything twice, as those who know his fine book, Second Readings, can attest. It's true I haven't read A Portrait of a Lady. I have read a lot of Henry James, and somehow that got by me, so I do have something to look forward to. I'm pleased to be following this group of students who talk about their favorite books from 5th grade, because as John suggested, I opened this little book, let me show it to you, on Conan Doyle, by an account of probably the greatest reading experience of my life, which took place in 5th grade. I came from a family that didn't read books. I went to an elementary school which was all right, but nothing exceptional. But we did have a special book club, a paperback book club, where the scholastic publishers would send out a 4-page newsletter, and the students were allowed to choose books and buy paperbacks for 25 or 35 cents. There would always be a little picture of the cover of the book, as well as a description of it. And one fall, September, early on, I noticed this strange picture of something on a crag, a moonlit night, and a mysterious title, The Hound of the Baskervilles. And underneath the description said, what was it that came out of the moors at night to spread terror and violent death? Well, this is obviously a book that any self-respecting, 5th grader, at least a boy 5th grader, and many girl 5th graders would want to read. So I ordered this book, and knew that I would have to wait for the exactly right time to read it. Ideally, I wanted a dark and stormy night. I wanted my parents and my 3 sisters, as I sometimes call them, my 3 weird sisters, out of the house. Well, eventually a time came in early November when skies were gray and my mother announced that they were going to go visit relatives that evening. I could stay home. The girls were going with my parents. So that afternoon I pedaled off to Whalen's drugstore, bought some Orange Crush and a couple of candy bars, came home, dragged down a blanket from my bed to this recliner we had in the living room, turned off all the lights in the house except the light next to the recliner, pulled the cover over me, and got my provisions close at hand and began to read The Hound of the Baskervilles. Well, in a lifetime of reading, and reading lots of different kinds of books, I think that evening is still the summit. Life has never been any better than it was that evening, particularly when I came to the end of the 2nd chapter, when Dr. Mortimer, who has come to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to talk about the strange death of Sir Charles Baskerville and the fact that he'd found mysterious footprints on the ground near the body. And Holmes turns to Dr. Mortimer and then says, "Footprints, a man's or a woman's?" To which he receives the most famous reply, I think the greatest reply in all of 20th century literature. "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound." Well, that made me a Conan Doyle fan, a Sherlock Holmes fan. I went to the branch library, checked out the collected stories with a wonderful introduction by Christopher Morley. Christopher Morley grew up in Baltimore, and he talks about growing up in Baltimore and going to the Pratt Library and getting Conan Doyle books out and reading them by street lamps. As he would race home, he'd read a paragraph or a page under each lamp, a street light. Morley later went on to found the Baker Street Irregulars, along with his 2 brothers, Felix and Frank Morley. Felix Morley at one time was the editor of the Washington Post, the executive editor of the Washington Post. Frank Morley was a partner with T.S. Eliot in the publishing firm of Faber and Faber. And Eliot, too, was a great Sherlock Holmes fan, as I was later to discover. Well, from this initial encounter with Sherlock Holmes, I became fascinated both by Holmes, detective stories, and Conan Doyle. And this book that I've written is not a biography. It's not a work of scholarship. It's a work of affection, of enthusiasm. It's a kind of memoir with a certain amount of, number of précises of the stories that Conan Doyle was to write. I later discovered that he also wrote another terrific series about George Edward Challenger, who leads a famous expedition to the Lost World where dinosaurs still roam the earth, and has a number of other adventures as well. They're not as famous. He wrote terrific ghost stories. He wrote all sorts of historical fiction. He wrote nonfiction. He wrote essays. He was a letter writer to the Times, protesting everything from the atrocities in the Belgian Congo to urging divorce law reform. He was an interesting man of letters and what we would call today a public intellectual. But for the most part, Sherlock Holmes has overshadowed Conan Doyle's other accomplishments. So I wanted this book to be in part about Holmes and Watson and their relationship, but also about Conan Doyle's other work that people might enjoy if they've already liked the stories about the sleuth of Baker Street. And the last element that I wanted to bring in was the Baker Street Irregulars themselves. For those, some of you probably know that this is a group that was founded by Morley and his brothers in 1934, still goes on today, and its members are devoted to what's called the canon, the 56 short stories and 4 novels of Sherlock Holmes, and spend their time, or some of their time at least, doing kind of pseudo-scholarship, not pseudo, real scholarship of a kind of fanciful nature trying to harmonize the discrepancies in the stories, to work out the chronology of Holmes's life and adventures, to explain what he was doing after he left, when he was on the great hiatus after he survived the tumble into the Reichenbach Falls, and all sorts of other wonderfully eccentric but fun activities that involve Sherlock Holmes. So I write about this group, and it's one I urge that if you're a fan of Holmes and Watson, you might want to look into becoming involved with. There are local Holmes societies. The one in Washington is called the Red Circle. It was started in the 1950s when calling a group the Red Circle was a little bit daring. And from there truly in the McCarthy era it was started. And eventually there's the grand organization which meets every January, around January 6th, the presumed birthday of Sherlock Holmes, to celebrate his life and work. I'm going to pause here a little minute. I will talk a little bit more about my book, but I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. So let me say that, please, if you have questions about Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, me reviewing this book, come forth in just a couple of minutes, and we'll have something of a dialogue, a conversation. This fall and the last couple of years has been really a great period for Sherlockians. There's been a revival in every media practically. There was not too long ago the wonderful Jeremy Brett series. Right now there have been two competing series that probably some of you know about. There are the movies with starring Robert Downey Jr. as a kind of gritty steampunk action hero, Sherlock Holmes. And there is the wonderful BBC Sherlock series with Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, set in the 21st century, where Sherlock Holmes and Watson are much younger and sort of sexy and moody in the kind of Doctor Who way. And the stories yet are very faithful to the spirit of the original Holmes adventures. And the relationship in both these competing series of Holmes and Watson is really wonderful. For a long time, we always thought of Watson as this bumbling dolt. For those of you who remember the Basil Rathbone films, Nigel Bruce played him as this, essentially this idiot. In fact, Watson is an interesting guy. He's a soldier, he's a doctor, he's been wounded in action. He has an experience of women that extends over 3 continents. He's married several times. He is a much more interesting man than Nigel Bruce played him. And fortunately, we get that from both with Jude Law and Martin Freeman in their interpretations of the role. And there have been lots of pastiches of late. Last year, Anthony Horowitz wrote The House of Silk. There are a number of anthologies of stories. One of my friends, the science fiction writer Neil Gaiman, I brought into the Baker Street Irregulars. He wrote a wonderful couple of stories for, I thought, one, A Study in Emerald, which won a Hugo Award. There's just a lot of interest in Sherlock Holmes and Watson right now. And why is that? I think there are any number of reasons, but for a guy at least, Sherlock Holmes really lives the kind of life that most boys would like. There's no women around except for Mrs. Hudson, who just comes around to give you food and take care of the place, clean up after you. You get to shoot your gun in your apartment, take drugs, hang out with your best friend most of the time, dress up in disguises, go fight bad guys. What a better life could there be, really? I mean, this is what we all wanted when we were 14 years old. And Holmes gets to live this out. And in another way, it's also a wonderful portrait of a friendship. We don't have as many great pictures of male friendship. And Holmes and Watson are really a terrific example of this. And in fact, as you read the stories, you see how Holmes starts off as this sort of coldly analytical thinking machine and is gradually humanized by his relationship with Watson, his friendship with Watson. There's a lot I could say about about Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle. But I'm going to open up for questions now. If there aren't very many questions, I'll continue talking and maybe read a bit from my book. But usually there are lots of questions. So please, we'll start here. Come to the microphone. Ask anything at all that you would like. Yes?
Yes, there's a new CBS series that's starting where Watson is a woman. I don't know if you've heard about that, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to talk about that possible dynamic.
Did everyone hear the question? It's about there's going to be a third series, or a new series at least, in America, in which Holmes and Watson it's set in, I gather, the present day. It's, I think, starting in a couple of days. Watson's going to be played by a woman, Lucy Liu. And this, of course, is nothing new to the Baker Street Irregulars. Probably the most famous paper ever given at one of the banquets, at one of the dinners, was given by the great mystery writer Rex Stout, in which he proved through close analysis of the stories that Watson was a woman. And it's a brilliant piece of scholarship, of logic. It's irrefutable, although people have tried to refute it. But this is the kind of playfulness, joyful playfulness, that characterizes members of the BSI. And there have been a lot of interesting people who have been members. Franklin Roosevelt was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, for example. Another question.
Well, you mentioned that the Baker Street Irregulars do this research, and I was wondering if you could talk about what the top open research questions are.
The top open questions?
Yes, for the Baker Street Irregulars.
The top open question. Well, there are always questions about, for example, the chronology. There are about 8 or 9, at least, different attempts to provide a chronology of the stories and of Holmes's ages and activities. Perhaps the most debated question that's been raging for years and years is a simple one. Where did Holmes go to the university? Was it Oxford or Cambridge? There are people, Christopher Morley, who grew up in Baltimore, claimed that Holmes actually came to America to go to Johns Hopkins. And you can assert anything you want, in a sense, about the stories and through the irregulars, but you have to be able to prove it. You have to bring evidence from the canon to show that why your supposition is not just the supposition, but is correct. There are then, of course, the other always interesting set of problems, the stories that Watson refers to but never actually tells. The most famous of which, of course, is the adventure of the giant rat of Sumatra. But there are many, many others. And people have tried to, why is it called? He talks about the adventures of the Grace Pattersons in the island of Uffa, in the Isle of Uffa. Why does he say in rather than on? And there are all sorts of explanations for this preposition, in instead of on. So there are any number of wonderful things you can do in scholarship. For example, the very first adventure, A Scandal in Bohemia. To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. Irene Adler. Was there anything between Irene Adler and Sherlock Holmes beyond this one adventure? Watson says that no, the Holmes had no feelings for the better sex. That they would interfere with his work. But people have always wondered whether perhaps during the Great Hiatus, after he wandered off toward Tibet, that maybe he hooked up with Irene Adler somewhere on his way there. There's speculation that he, or if not he, perhaps Mycroft, his brother, who sometimes is the British government, might be the father of Nero Wolfe, the huge detective. Mycroft is a rather big guy, and Nero Wolfe, weighs a third of a ton or something. And that this is the product of this liaison. But all these things are possible, but you need to try and prove them. Let's see. I guess we'll go back to this side.
Yes. My question is, why do you think that Conan Doyle, an author who created a character ruled by science and reason, later in life got involved in spiritualism and fairies and things like that? What happened? What the dichotomy? How did it come about?
The question is about why did Conan Doyle become involved with spiritualism and fairies at the end of his life? You know, fairies actually ran in his family, so to speak. His father and his uncle, they all were noted Victorian illustrators of fairyland. Richard Doyle's In Fairyland is a very famous set of pictures. His father thought he saw fairies when his father was deluded and was in an insane asylum for a while. And of course, we think of Sherlock Holmes is archetypally English, but Conan Doyle himself is of Irish descent and was brought up in Edinburgh, where there's a lot more openness to the idea of the other world and of fairy realms. But for him, it was simply he was the kind of guy who lived by convictions. He felt that people needed to live heroic lives, they needed to have purposes to them, and once he became convinced, and it's a long, complicated story, of the truth of spiritualism, he felt it was his obligation to crusade for this, to spread this message to others, and spent the last dozen or so years of his life doing so. He, of course, never allowed Sherlock Holmes to become involved with fairies. He said no spooks need apply here in one of the stories. But his other major character, Professor Challenger, in the last adventure, The Land of Mist, becomes convinced that the spiritual realm does exist. But it's a complicated question, and perhaps the best account of it can be found in a wonderful biography by my friend Dan Stashower, another member of the Baker Street Irregulars and a Washingtonian, called Teller of Tales, a biography of Conan Doyle with a particular interest in this spiritual theme that runs through his life. Yes?
Yes, actually, my question
Closer,
is very much related to his. That what appealed to me about the Sherlock Holmes stories were this haunted quality, the hound, the mystery, and that you have this quintessentially scientific, evidence-based detective who happens to be a drug addict, and drug addicts go off on flights of out-of-body experiences. So I'm wondering if it doesn't connect to something larger going on societally, in which there was, you've got the Enlightenment with all its anti-superstition things pushing for science, at the same time that you still have the more powerful literary forces of the imagination. I'm not sure if you have anything to add to what you just said.
That's a complex sort of question. The 1890s, though, were a period where there was a great interest in the supernatural. This is, of course, the real birth of the modern ghost story.
Right.
You have the great figures like M.R. James and then Arthur Machen were writing. People in the Victorian era had undergone this crisis of faith. They had lost the convictions that the traditional religions were always true, and they were searching for other ways of finding the spiritual in their lives. So you had at the same time the birth of the Society for Psychical Research, where scientists would look into the possible evidence for survival after death. These things were very much in the air. The 1890s too was also the great period of the aesthetic movement of Oscar Wilde. Of course, one of the most famous stories about involving Conan Doyle is when he'd written the first Sherlock Holmes novel, and it had done reasonably well, but had not taken the world by storm. And he might never have written again about Sherlock Holmes after a study in Scarlet. But a guy from Lippincott's magazine in Philadelphia came to England and took out the two hottest writers that he thought, young writers, in England to dinner for a publisher's lunch dinner. And that night he signed up both of them to write novels. So Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Arthur Conan Doyle wrote The Sign of the Four. So then there's a wonderful passage in Conan Doyle's memoirs, and I cite a big chunk of it in this book, of where he remembers that evening with Oscar Wilde. So this aesthetic aspect was also part of Sherlock Holmes' makeup. He does live this sort of an aesthetic life. Okay? Then.
The subtitle of your book is The Art of Storytelling. Is that correct?
The title of my book is On Conan Doyle. It has a subtitle, or The Whole Art of Storytelling.
Right.
And that's a kind of in-joke, because Sherlock Holmes, of course, is working on throughout his life, off and on, and supposedly he's going to finish during his retirement on the Sussex Downs, his great masterwork, The Whole Art of Detection. So this is why it's the whole art of storytelling.
Yeah, that is what I wanted to ask him. What is so peculiar about his art of storytelling? Because storytelling...
I'm sorry, I can't. Could you speak closer to the microphone?
What was so special about his storytelling that you are referring to it as the art of storytelling? In other words, what I mean is that storytelling is pretty common.
The stories are what?
Storytelling is a pretty common phenomenon.
Oh, yes.
But what was so peculiar about his storytelling?
What was so peculiar about Conan Doyle? Well, we'll start with his editor. His editor at the Strand magazine said that Conan Doyle was the greatest natural-born storyteller in his entire experience. And this period, of course, from the late 19th century until the late 1920s, the period of Conan Doyle's life and Sherlock Holmes' stories, was a great age of storytelling when we had the birth of all our modern genres: science fiction, horror, fantasy, detective fiction, the great iconic figures from Peter Pan to the Prisoner of Zenda to the Scarlet Pimpernel, they were all created in this one period. This was a great age of storytelling. And so if the editor of the major magazine of the time determines that Conan Doyle was the great storyteller, that says something. The other aspect I wanted to stress was that he was a master in many genres. Whatever he turned his hand to, he was good at. For example, he wrote contemporary novels. There's one I talk about briefly. I will talk about several, but one called The Tragedy of the Carrasco, which is a very modern flavor. It's about a group of Western tourists on a pleasure tour of the Middle East on the Nile who are kidnapped by Islamic terrorists, taken into the desert. The men are going to be executed and the women sold into, or the younger women, sold into a harem, unless they all agree to convert to Islam. And what happens? And it's a very, very modern story. He was attuned to these things. He was very much involved with all sorts of social issues of the day and not just writing detective stories. Of course, he himself felt that his Sherlock Holmes stories were not as important as his historical novels, his history of the First World War, or his spiritualist writings. But he did believe that storytelling was something that should impart values, ideally heroic values, to live noble lives for all of us. And he hoped to inspire people to do so through his work. This is an unpopular microphone on this side, There's nobody here. I'm going to answer my questions pointing this way. Wait, we have a volunteer who has come forth to be sacrificed.
I've heard a couple of
Very
authors,
close to the microphone, otherwise I can't hear you.
I've heard a couple of authors use the term public intellectual. Could you give us a definition?
What's a public intellectual? It's somebody who becomes who's well enough known that people pay attention to his or her opinions when they talk about contemporary events. That's off the cuff. So I think, and he was that sort of guy. I mean, he was a famous author, and but he was an activist when the Boer War broke out. Here's one of the world's most famous authors. He went down there and he volunteered as a doctor and worked in fever wards for months down during the Boer War. He was a man who believed in principles, and he tried to live by them himself. Yes, close to the microphone.
Hi. What would you consider the most accurate biography on Conan Doyle? There have been several.
What is the best or the most accurate biography on Conan Doyle? I've already mentioned one, perhaps The Best Teller of Tales by Dan Stashower, which won the Edgar Award. I will point out this book also won the Edgar Award this year for best work of criticism and biography. Another guy named Andrew Lycett wrote a recent biography, which is also very good because it had access to some material that has only come recently on the market. But let me add, too, that there's no substitute for reading Conan Doyle's own work. And there have been several books by a man named John Lellenberg, who is a great authority on Conan Doyle, and Dan Stashower, in which they have reprinted the letters of Conan Doyle, his first novel, which was recently discovered, called The Narrative of John Smith, and coming out this fall, Conan Doyle's diaries from his experiences as a young man on a whaler in the Arctic. After he got out of school, even while he was still in school partly, he spent several months as the kind of the ship's doctor going whaling, and he was a big guy, although we think of authors as sort of mild-mannered sorts. Conan Doyle was big. He loved sports. He helped introduce skiing into Switzerland. He played on a cricket team that his friend J.M. Barrie, the creator of Peter Pan, had started with mostly authors. And when he was on this ship as a ship's doctor, they asked him if he'd like to become a harpooner, and they offered him like a full-time job if he'd give up medical school and become a harpooner. So you never know. He could have been a kind of Queeg instead of the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Another question. Oh, wait, we have a question on this side. Close to the mic.
Your discourse was so fascinating that I almost forgot my question, but I wanted to mention that the Mormon Church was recruiting quite successfully in England in Doyle's day, in the 19th century, and that his first story, A Study in Scarlet, do I have that right, takes place partly in the Great Western Desert.
That's correct. It does, in fact, involve Mormons.
I wanted you to elucidate just how did all this happen? How did it inspire him?
Well, in general, Conan Doyle was very interested in America. A lot of his stories have their roots in America, and not only just because of the Mormons, but one of his famous stories, not a very good story, but an interesting one called The Yellow Face, which turns on the fact that a woman who was married to an Englishman had earlier been married to a black man, has a child who is of mixed race, and this is the crux of the story. And at the end, her new husband accepts the child, and Conan Doyle met a famous abolitionist when he was on another voyage in Africa. He was very sympathetic to the plights of black Americans. One of his early stories turns on just such incidents, and it recurs. Sherlock Holmes comes out of retirement just before the First World War and goes to America, disguises himself as an Irish revolutionary, essentially, and to infiltrate a German network. And so there's a lot of America in the stories, and he came here frequently and lectured, and also to Canada, and traveled a great deal in the cause of spiritualism or his own writing. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is your opinion of the multi-book Sherlock Holmes annotated. Then the second thing, those of us who are fascinated by your reviews in the Post are, I'm sure, wanting to know how you retain or how you research and make allusions to these books that may have been written 100 years ago or you read 30 years ago, and open up our eyes to that world that you're knowledgeable of. How do you compose your...
Okay, the first question first about the new annotated Sherlock Holmes. There was an older version by W.S. Baring Gould called The Annotated Sherlock Holmes, in which he presented the stories along with irregular scholarship, commentary notes explaining the stories. The new annotated version brings this up to date. It's by a friend of mine, another member of the BSI, Les Klinger. It's in 3 volumes. And I helped get this, I helped Les and Norton, who was then my publisher, connect on this project, so I have a special interest in it. It's a wonderful compendium of irregular scholarship. That is, it's not true. It's the sort of thing I was talking about earlier. If, however, you want to read the factual background to the stories, and you have the actual historical record of what was happening during this time, what these allusions are, there is another wonderful series in handsome little volumes about this size called the Oxford Sherlock Holmes. There are, I think, 11 volumes, for each of the books in the Sherlock Holmes canon, with introductions by noted scholars. And those are also very good, and they're also of a handy size. The new annotated are big, giant books you need a lectern or a table at least to read by. As for my reviewing and the allusions, I guess you can say this is a sign of a misspent youth and middle age. I've spent a lot of time reading books. I have a good memory for books, at least up till recently, getting older. I like to read. I mean, I do. I have other, I have other things in my life too. I have a wife and 3 children, which is an evidence of that. I just remember things. Plus, I live in a house full of books. I see the books. I interact with the books. I go to used bookstores. So works of literature are always sort of floating in and out of my mind. And when I think of something that I think will illuminate a new book, I will mention it. And even though I write a lot for the Post, I write just as much for other places. I write for the New York Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement and all sorts of magazines and things. I live by my pen, and this is why you need to go and buy this book, so you help keep me in business, so I don't starve. And I have a child still at William and Mary to get through, so please help me out. Another question, yes.
You asked at the beginning what it is that, why is Holmes so popular? Every Thursday night, I religiously watch the Jeremy Brett series. I've seen them over and over and over. And one of the things that strikes me, and one of the things I think I like about it, is that Sherlock Holmes is able to take the law in his hands.
Yes.
He decides who to turn in and who not to turn in. And so there's an inherent sense of fairness in them that is not just based on the legal, which is appealing to me.
Sherlock Holmes doesn't always follow the letter of the law. He is not a policeman. He is a consulting detective. He is his own man. So he can decide where justice will be better served. If he will let someone go if he thinks it's the right thing to do, or if he feels someone has suffered enough, or if perhaps there might be the right, that their course of action was justified. And in that sense, he's acting as a kind of vigilante, I suppose, at times. But I think he sees himself more as an angel of vengeance, but also an angel of mercy, in helping people and doing what he feels justice demands rather than the law.
Dr. Watson was wounded in Afghanistan,
At
wasn't he?
Maiwan, the Battle of Maiwan,
Yeah.
a Jezal bullet.
So if you can channel Watson and Holmes and ask them about our American involvement in Afghanistan, our faith and practice and the way we do it, policing and so on, what advices might they give us, and talk about the nature of our different kinds of woundedness and how do we know it and for whom should we pay?
Okay. You'll know that when Holmes and Watson first meet in the stories, Holmes is at St. Bart's Hospital, banging on a corpse to see what bruising will result. And he looks up and he sees Watson, and his first words to Watson are, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." If you've seen the BBC production, Benedict Cumberbatch looks up at Martin Freeman and he says, "Iraq or Afghanistan?" ? I don't know what advice they would give. If we were to follow Conan Doyle himself, being a kind of loyal, patriotic Englishman, he would feel that his country, right or wrong, we should proceed and follow through on this adventure. Whether Holmes would feel that way, it might be a different matter. But these are dark waters. Yes.
In your opening remarks, you made reference to Sherlock Holmes' pastiches, and I'm curious what your opinion of them are. Are there any that actually rise to the level of Doyle, like the Solar Ponds series by August Derleth, or are there any others that you think are worth?
The pastiches and parodies of Sherlock Holmes. The parodies are the ones that make fun. Pastiches are the ones where you try to imitate the stories. And you see both of them. There's a wonderful pastiche by Vincent Sterrett, who's one of the founding members of the Baker Street Irregulars, who wrote The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, where he tried to explain just that. But he wrote The Adventure of the Unique Hamlet, and you would almost say it was a Sherlock Holmes story. But then you have people like P.G. Wodehouse, creator of Jeeves and Wooster. And Jeeves and Wooster, of course, are essentially Holmes and Watson in reverse. And Woodhouse always said, his master, his model for as an author was Conan Doyle. But he has one of his great Mulliner stories, and I happen to quote it in here, so I'll read it. And he has a series of stories about a family of Mulliners. But Adrian Mulliner is a detective. The story begins, looking back over my years as a detective, I recall many problems, the solutions of which made me modestly proud. But though all of them undoubtedly presented certain features of interest and tested my powers to the utmost, I can think of none of my feats of ratiocination which gave me more pleasure than the unmasking of the man Sherlock Holmes, now better known as the Fiend of Baker Street. And he goes on from there. It's a wonderful short story. I recommend it to everyone. But there are wonderful pastiches as well. So all of modern ones, and they're worth checking out.
Really appreciate that you singled out Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes legacy for this special treatment. I just wonder, do you have other authors, maybe very famous or not so famous, that you may receive similar treatment by you in future years?
Oh, would I be writing another book about someone like Conan Doyle? I'd certainly like to write some other books, and there are a number of writers that I do enjoy. The book I really would like to write, if I could get some trade publisher to advance me a lot of money, would be about this what I think of as the great age of storytelling, the people I were talking about between about 1875 and 1930. Last spring and the spring before at the University of Maryland, I taught courses in the adventure novel. The first one was the classic adventure novel, 1885 to 1915, began with King Solomon's Mines, included The Time Machine, The Prisoner of Zenda, The Scarlet Pimpernel, Tarzan, Kim. It ended with The 39 Steps, or a number of others. Then I did the modern adventure novel, and I began with Princess of Mars, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and did A Coffin for Demetrius, and all sorts of other books, and ended with The Princess Bride, William Goldman's. But that came later. But the original, that period, that one generation, basically Conan Doyle's lifetime, 1859, 1930, was, I think, a remarkable time for the generation of the kinds of stories that we read when young and that stay with us for the rest of our lives, that Hollywood mines for all its greatest movies, Captain Blood, all these adventure stories, pirate stories, everything goes back to this one generation. And I would like to write a big book about it, but whether it'll ever come about, I don't know.
My question takes a little bit of a different tack. It's clear that you have taken your childhood love of reading and made a life out of it. For those young people in the audience who are passionate about reading and writing and interested in books, could you talk just a little bit about how you created the life that you have, just in terms of your education and your career, and what influences have been helpful to you along the way?
Actually, I could tell you a very simple way to find all those things out. I wrote a book about it, a memoir called An Open Book. And it's the story basically about my life up to the age of 19 with the theme that runs throughout it of books. Because I grew up in a classic Ohio steel town. My parents didn't read books. My father never finished high school. I did not come from a bookish world at all. But I discovered reading. It enchanted me, and it gradually became both a passion in my life and a way that I thought I could enlarge my life. And I could leave Lorain, Ohio. Lorain, Ohio, by the way, is also the birthplace of my friend and the famous novelist Toni Morrison. Last year we talked about Lorain here. And so for me, it was just the love of reading. I knew that I wanted to have a life involved with words and books. I didn't know whether I'd be a college teacher or, if I were lucky, a writer. As it turned out, I became something in between, a literary journalist. I've still occasionally thought about going back to writing stories. There is a kind of story in this book, by the way, talking about the pastiches. When you're invested into the Baker Street Irregulars, you're given a name from the canon, that is from the stories, a name that sort of reflects your character, your personality, or your profession. My name, And by the way, there are only a couple of hundred people, maybe 300 in the BSI's main organization, is Langdale Pike. Langdale Pike appears in just about the worst Sherlock Holmes story of all. It's called The Adventure of the Three Gables. But at one point, Holmes turns to Watson and says, "Watson, this is a case for Langdale Pike, and I'm going to see him now." Langdale Pike is a gossip columnist for newspapers. And he sits in his club, and all the gossip and news of the city come to him. And so he's a great sort of filtering machine. He's sort of like Mycroft Holmes for the city of London's social world. And that's why I'm like. So I wrote a story, a pastiche story called "The Case for Langdale Pike," in which it's discovered that Holmes, in fact, has relied on Langdale Pike to solve all these mysteries. That Langdale Pike, instead of having the Baker Street Irregulars, the Baker Street Irregulars are led by a guy named Wiggins, who's the only street urchin named, so he's called Wiggins. Well, Langdale Pike, being a social guy, he has the Belgrave Square Irregulars, and their leader is named Whimsy. So, and I discovered, all these people are all the stories of the time, ghost stories and all adventures. It's revealed that Langdale Pike was actually had an affair with Jenny Jerome and is the true father of Winston Churchill. All sorts of things happen in this story. But it was me being playful in the mode of a regular scholarship. One very quick question, because I see we're on overtime.
Whose writings and notions influenced Conan Doyle?
What's that?
Whose writings and notions influenced and shaped Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
What writing
Whose writings and
who's writing? Conan Doyle actually wrote an entire book about the writers in his life. It's called Through the Magic Door. He takes you into his library, and he talks about the books that he loves. He loves history, loves military history in particular, talks about the 19th century novels. Edgar Allan Poe was a great influence. Holmes puts down Dupin, the detective in Poe. But in fact, Conan Doyle revered Poe as the great storyteller of the previous age. He learned a lot from O. Henry. He was an omnivorous reader, and his pleasure in books comes very much through in this little book. And I've tried to convey some of my own pleasure in reading Conan Doyle, and in books in general, in this book and my other books, and go to the bookstore and buy them and come have me sign them. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.